Welcome back, everybody, to another edition of Financial History. In this part of the course, we're going to be talking about some more modern institutions. We'll start off by having a discussion around companies and corporations and move on to things like stock markets, trusts, pensions, insurance companies, and finally the government itself as a financial institution. To bridge this, though, our gap between ancient finance and modern finance, the appropriate tool to discuss is most probably companies. Much like banking, they've been around for literally thousands of years and were created originally to assist us with the allocation of resources. One of the economists who wrote about this idea, the theory of the firm, was Ronald Coase. Back in the mid-1930s, he wanted to study the idea of why it was that companies existed. Many dismissed his interest at the time as simply being a waste of effort to study, simply because corporations at that point had already existed for centuries and their value seemed self-evident. But in exploring this question, Coase was able to shine light on exactly what aspects of corporations are creating value, and thus providing us with a little bit of a roadmap in the 20th and 21st centuries about how to improve corporations and enhance their value to us. So to consider briefly what it was that Coase had in mind when he published the theory of the firm in 1937, he started off by looking at a completely frictionless market, as is commonly the way that things are analyzed in finance or economics. Starting point is to assume away all of the real world complications and then systematically layer them back one by one, seeing what the implications of each of these frictions are for the costs associated with certain kinds of allocation systems. When he considered the possibility of a frictionless market, one with perfect information, no transaction costs, no transportation costs, then he realized that it would be relatively easy to coordinate a variety of specialists simply using these sorts of frictionless markets. And he argued that because the real world does not have this sort of frictionless environment, that it in fact regularly runs into challenges and complications associated with allocation, that people must have found the firm to be a lower cost system than simply negotiating with all possible parties every possible transaction to ensure that it's done in the optimal way at the lowest possible cost. So Coase's argument effectively boils down to the fact that the corporation is a more profitable and more efficient vehicle for resource allocation, particularly as we start to scale up to very large operations like pipelines that stretch across continents or airlines that fly people around the world. In these sorts of situations where supervision can be particularly challenging and perhaps tens of thousands of people are involved, the corporate form has turned out to be particularly practical for reducing the costs of markets like searching, bonding, supervision, contracting. All of these end up running up very significant real costs in the real world that are internalized within the corporation as they put all of this various specialists under the directions of managers, and all of those managers under the direction of directors. In fact, the root word behind corporation helps to expose this. The English word corporation comes from corporare in Latin, which means to combine into one body. So the notion here is that many people are working together to accomplish some particular objective, and that it's the objective that binds them together and creates a sense of affiliation, which will allow them to reduce the frictional costs associated with coordination. Now, as there with most kinds of institutions that allocate resources, there are going to be many variations on the theme related to the objectives that they pursue, various kinds of ownership patterns, and of course, the social constraints that they have to operate within. So in our lesson on companies today, we'll be looking at some of the various features that animate these organizations, the governance tools that are used to control them, and some of the different kinds of implications for the ownership patterns that we actually observe. Now, an important feature that is worth discussing is the notion that the publicly held corporation has been transformative in modern society. And the reason for this is because the gains of large-scale coordination become widespread across all owners. When a company is controlled by a handful of owners, then the gains of specialization often tend to be concentrated in the hands of the few. But when the ownership of a company is widespread, and the capital that they provide have generally been more politically stable, and their national wealth has multiplied more rapidly. In fact, one of the big problems that we observe throughout financial history is the inability of people to actively participate in these kinds of large scale coordination projects, simply because the frictional costs associated with were simply too high. As we moved into a world where there were tradable shares of corporations priced in relatively small amounts, and we developed secondary markets where these shares could be traded, one of the major barriers to entry for small investors was lifted, allowing households to participate directly in the gains of coordination in a way other than simply their wages. In fact, in the modern world, in many developed countries, we see that as much as half, if not more than half, of households end up directly or indirectly controlling shares of corporations, whether it's through their mutual funds or their self directed pension plans or other kinds of savings accounts. If we were to factor in public pension plans, corporate pension plans, and insurance companies, we would see that this ratio rises even higher. So, for some of the economists of the 19th century who were concerned about the workers controlling the means of production, it appears that modern capitalism has moved in favor of this kind of compromise position through widespread ownership of corporate shares.